Make every night a wonderful journey, no matter where you are. Good night, sweet dreams. The first story, Violets. Growing up, I'd been a fan of being told stories when I went to sleep at night. My mother would tuck me in, making sure I was as comfortable as I could be under my blue and green covers before diving into another anecdote of her own choice. Her stories were always pleasant, and in the event that I found one a bit scary, she'd tone it down a bit for me. They ranged from all origins. Some had been passed down through her family. Some she'd memorized from books and fairy tales. Some were her own creations, and some were true stories. But typically I liked each and every one of them. A select few to me greatly, and I'd memorize them, able to retell them by heart whenever I desired. The year of my 9th birthday, my mother fell ill. She would have various spasms throughout the day, vomiting all that she consumed. Some days were worse than others, and she would vomit blood instead. Her arms developed new scars on their own, and we never knew where they came from. Some were shallow and barely left a mark, while others were deep enough to spurt blood and beg for stitches. She'd cry in pain throughout the night, weeping out it hurts. It hurts all night long. I began to fear the night, began to tear up every time I saw the moon rise and tell me that my mother's pain was about to begin anew, that the cycle was about to repeat yet again. Even through her pain and suffering, my mother still always summed up the strength to limp into my room, ease herself onto the edge of my bed and comfort me with a story. In her last few days, her stories would become shorter and shorter, as though she were trying to adjust to the thought of a night without telling me a story, or at least trying to get me to. A night which she would sleep and not awaken, a night which was foreshadowed by her conditions. He tended to stay, to telling me true stories in those last days of hers, weaving tales of her childhood, and the memories of her graduation from college to pass the fleeting hours by. The shorter her stories became, the more anguished I was at the thought of losing my mother. One night, the night she passed away, to be precise, she told me a story I'd never heard before, in a tone I'd never heard her use. It wasn't evil or dark, per se. It struck me more as a soft, motherly tone, but with a hidden inlay of sadness and depression, and just a hint of malevolence locked into the words. She'd been looking particularly sad and tormented by her pain that night. She'd cried and cried all day, gashes having opened in her legs overnight. I was considering offering to let her skip her story tonight, although she hadn't missed a single story since I was a baby. It was like a tradition, a ritual. However, my less childlike instincts had told me, in a dark cloud in the back of my mind, that this may be the last story my mother ever tells me. It had been telling me this for weeks, but I believed the voice now more than ever. She'd sat down on the foot of my bed again tonight. As she always had, she looked weary, exhausted, crippled, ready to finally submit to death's embrace after her battle. She held my hand this night. She typically only held my hand while telling me a story. If it was a stormy night, or if I'd felt scared for one reason or another tonight, I only felt sadness at her composure, at the way she was presented. I found myself more disturbed that she was doing this to me tonight, since there wasn't a cloud to be found in the sky. She took a deep breath and began, her voice as weary as the rest of her. Flowers are a delicate thing. My son, always remember that they have just as much voice and volume as the rest of us, and yet they choose to stay rooted in the ground, portraying messages to one another silently. Over the centuries, we've begun to understand these messages. Think of how flowers are used today, what signs they convey. We pass roses on to our lovers, white carnations are an aspect of weddings. Often sunflowers may be the sort of thing we grow with our loved ones. To remember and cherish them by every flower has a meaning, and we have long yet to understand them all as you live your life. Examine each and every flower you see, for it may be trying to tell you something important. Sleeping that night was rough, as I was tossing and turning, trying to ignore my mother's cries of pain. They were more jagged tonight, more agonized, more foreboding of her passing than ever. Around 1100, they ceased for good. I sobbed quietly into my pillow, reciting my mother's stories to myself in the depths of my mind, trying to keep her next to me as long as I possibly could. Her funeral was arranged, and I was stone-faced as I gazed at the spectacle of my mother's burying on that day. My father was crying, my aunts and uncles were crying, my grandparents were crying, and yet, standing there, dressed in a mourning shade of black, I felt not a drop of sadness. Her agony was gone, and she was in a better place now. I still heard her stories, and every time I heard one I felt warmer, with the exception of her final story. That is, no matter how many times I'd recited it to myself, having stored it deep in my memory, I never felt a single drop of warmth from it. It sounded depressed and laced with surrender to enjoy. It didn't feel like a story, more like a passage you might see in a textbook, or something similar. Over the years, I'd finally forgotten the entire story, save the general idea of it, the explanation of the messages of the flowers, and able to follow in my mother's footsteps. I never saw anything special about the flowers as she did, or might have. 9 years after her death, as my 18th birthday drew near, I went to visit my mother's grave. Our soil was quite fertile where I had grown up, and naturally, flowers had sprung up around her gravestone, which, in itself, was faded and riddled with vines and leaves. I was no expert on flowers, but I recognized the plants themselves to be violets. One, I noticed, was tenderly pushing at the topsoil, trying to bathe itself in the warmth of the sun and evolve into the beauty of those around it. Although it had been so long since I'd heard her story or visited her grave, I felt drawn, attached almost, to this tiny bud beneath the soil. I felt as though there was a secret tangled in its roots, and I shook my head at the thought that a plant, of all things, could be hiding something from me. Nevertheless, that night, I vomited for no reason. I called in sick to work, and my girlfriend, who'd been staying with me for several months, called up a doctor to make a house call and examine me. I was feverish and felt flu-like symptoms, but there was nothing the doctor saw that was out of the ordinary. Albeit our confusion at the causes of symptoms, he ordered me to be put on bed rest for several days, and gave me medicine for the nausea. The next morning, I went to visit my mother's grave again, almost drawn there by an invisible force. Something compelled me to visit, and I wasn't sure what it was exactly. I prayed to her, as I always did, and told her about my day. As I was just about to leave, I noticed out of the corner of my eye that the violet seedling had germinated a bit more, just beginning to develop its first leaves. The next day, I awoke with slashes on my arms that burned, swelling and oozing as though they were infected. My girlfriend, who was trained in first aid, immediately wrapped them in tight bandages after coating them in a thick layer of disinfectant. There were, for total, all of varying depths and severities, The pain became more intense at night, and the moment the moon climbed to the top of the night sky, I shouted in agony at the stars, my wounds ablaze in unseen pain, as though someone was tearing away my skin just beneath them. Even through this pain, I awoke at the crack of dawn to visit my mother's grave once more. The baby violet was growing at a steady pace, its leaf halfway grown, and 4 small buds protruding from the stem. The following hours of the day, I was weary, my pain having dulled during the day from my gashes. I spent most of the day lying in bed as my girlfriend checked on me occasionally, leaving a fresh wet cloth on my forehead, or sitting and spooning hot soup into my mouth. I was lethargic and desired sleep more than anything on this planet, but found my body racked with insomnia. My exhaustion tormented me to the point where I was seeing things, shadows moving out of the corners of my eyes, objects moving ever so slightly, as though they were being pushed or pulled, everything to fuel my paranoia. Nevertheless, I was drawn to my mother's grave by a magnetic force yet again, my eyes heavy and blurry from the lack of rest. Although the view blurred and swam before my eyes, I could clearly see the slowly blossoming buds on the stem of the growing violet. That morning, I began to see the first symptoms of my vision fading. I couldn't tell certain objects apart anymore, and obviously, I was unable to read. My skin was becoming pale, my best features leaving me one by one. Even with glasses, I was barely unable to tell my girlfriend apart from a man walking down the street, or a child playing tag with his friends outside as the day progressed. My vision blurred and darkened, so that by night, there wasn't much difference between what I saw when I closed my eyes and what I saw when I opened them. My wounds burned again as usual, and I knew my time was coming soon. Even so, I found myself begging my girlfriend to drive me to my mother's grave the next morning, and she watched helplessly as I limped to my mother's grave, giving her a brief prayer before gazing down at the plant. It was too large to call a seedling now, as it was nearing complete maturity, its buds slowly opening and nearing full bloom before my dimming eyes. The 5th day of my nightmarish sickness, there were no new symptoms, and everything seemed to dull, as though my pain was nearing its end at last. But with its passing would follow my whole life, my being, my existence that day. My girlfriend sobbed as I told her that I was nearing the end. I jotted down a detail. Well, as I awaited the doctor's arrival, as we called him once more, he told me solemnly that there was nothing he could do, and yet I felt no remorse that I would finally be relieved of my illness. After all the preparations were made, including my girlfriend calling up a funeral home cheerfully in advance, I asked for one last drive to my mother's grave. My girlfriend helped me limp towards the symbolic stone yet again, and I felt my strength fading the closer I drew to it, just as I reached down to touch the stone one last time before I passed on. The ground came out from under me, meeting the side of my face head-on. My girlfriend shrieked, picking up the phone and pounding the keys for 911 to do what they could for me. As blood trickled from both my skull and my mouth, I saw, just as my eyes began to close for the final time, that the violet was in full bloom, a deep indigo, as though all this time it had leached off of my spirit. Who would be next to fertilize the violets? As my mother and I had. The second story, not chocolate. Theo's parents were the first ones on the block to get the moving picture box. The outside was wooden, with a sort of sheen to it that made Ricky think of metal. Ricky loved to watch the grayscale and newly colored concoctions with his best friend, and the same could be said for Theo. You could even say they were film fanatics, always trying to figure out how the directors did it. They would take notes and talk about becoming famous directors when they were grown-ups, from King Kong to The Blob. They read anything about filmmaking they could get their hands on. Whatever you needed to know something about a film, they were the kids to go to. Psycho was always Ricky's favorite, in part because he loved the story, but also because he admired the use of black and white to use chocolate rather than blood. It was a clever idea, and it reminded him of how a child would choose to represent blood. His favorite movies were always horror, and this one was no exception. His favorite scene was the shower scene, where the viewer had to use their imagination to fill in the gap. Ricky thought that the killer stabbed in a different way, speed, and depth every time, and each time he saw the film he felt like he was watching a completely different movie. Ricky and Theodore often spent their nights in front of a television, and more than once they wrecked films by sleeping halfway through them. This was never really a problem, as these movies tended to be romance or educational. Not that the movies weren't worth studying, but they could be so dull at times. One day they were watching Psycho, and Theo just couldn't stay up, having gone sleepless the night before. "Make sure to turn the film off when you sleep," Theo mumbled as he drifted off. Ricky looked at him with weary eyes, and then proceeded to move to the television and turn the tape off. There was no way he would be able to stay up for that scene, he thought to himself as he reached for the reel contained within a black box. Theo happily sawed logs as Ricky moved him to the couch and made a makeshift bed with a few comforters and a white pillow. As Ricky faded off, his mind went to the shower scene and the many combinations of knife and skin. Static buzzed in Ricky's ear. Ricky slowly opened his eyes, his face instantly moving towards the gritty sound. Static covered the sleek metal television. He assumed that he just forgot to turn the television off when he was preparing for bed. As it happened, he didn't remember turning the television off. He sat up, annoyed by the sound, and wondering how Theo was able to sleep over this racket. As his hand approached, the static distorted and a hand slammed across the screen, startling poor Ricky. Ricky looked on in at the white bomb, distorted among the static, and then changed to fear as the image became clear. There was no color, but the scene was unmistakable. There was Theo. Ricky was positive of that. And that man, no, that beast, that thing barely qualified. Its smile was pleasant, its clothing plain spoken, its eyes, that was where it all went wrong. They were it all grey, fleck of gold, and full of menace. There was no other word for it. He lifted a clawed hand and waved at Theo. Aware of the boy on the other side of the screen, Ricky looked behind him and saw that Theo wasn't there. Ricky looked back with unfortunate timing, as now that the creature's face covered the screen, those gold flecks, the only thing colored in this grayscale film. Theo. Ricky remembered that he wasn't the one in danger. Theo was in there with that beast. Ricky's hands were beating against the screen, yelling for Theo as the flesh on his arms prickled. His mind raced to unplug the television, but what would happen to Theo? His rational mind stayed his hand, even though his emotions screamed for the plug to pull out. The beast smiled and smiled a bit more, as rows and rows of teeth were showing themselves, each sharper and blacker than the last, as the beast turned around and stepped towards Theo. Theo was caught like a deer in the headlights. Ricky looked in a sort of Disgusted as the man with the gold flecks pulled out a knife and the view changed to Theo's, with the man with the gold flecks twirling the knife between his fingers. It switched to a side view double shot, showing both of the characters sharing a long stare for what felt like eternity. Then the camera became focused on the shadows, and even though Ricky never saw the actual characters, he watched with a horrific clarity as Theo was stabbed for what seemed like a few hours, but was more likely a few seconds. Tears drenched his sockets as the camera moved to follow a dark, milky liquid down the drain. And it was not chocolate. The third story, Nightmare's Revenge. You could say that I was one of those big Pokémon fans as a kid. I had first gotten into the fandom by the age of 10. Sprite of Nightmare the Younger. My siblings and I watched the anime every chance we got. We bought a few of the toys, along with the trading cards, and even saw each Pokémon movie we had the chance to see. It wasn't until the Christmas of 1999, the year my siblings and I became fans, that we each got a Pokémon game. My sister got Pokémon Blue, my brother Pokémon Red, and I got Pokémon Yellow. The more we played our Pokémon, the more fascinated we became with the franchise. Eventually, we started getting more and more Pokémon games as we got newer consoles. By the time I got Pokémon Ruby in 2005 and I got all 8 badges, I started to have trouble finding the Pokémon League, due to my frustration of not only trying to find something, but also trying to catch them all. I lost interest in the Pokémon video games. Since then, I had not played any of my Pokémon games. Flash forward to October 2010. I was cruising through DeviantArt when I came across fan art of a strange type of story called Lost Silver. Out of curiosity, I had read the story and watched the accompanying fan-made video. I had unfortunately made the mistake of reading them really late at night. However, as time went by, I became more and more fascinated by these stories of video game playing gone horribly wrong. Stories simply known as creepypastas. Because of the creepypastas, I had found myself digging out my old copy of Pokémon Yellow and my yellow Game Boy and playing the game once again. It had felt quite strange yet amazing to play a game I once loved again. By the time that Pokémon Black and White had been announced, I was pretty excited. However, for some unknown reason, I had the urge to get Pokémon Soul Silver instead. I managed to get the game after my 2011 spring semester at college had ended, and I played it to my heart's content. Due to my long hours of gameplay, I managed to catch quite a handful of Pokémon. True, it was not every single Pokémon that could be caught in the game, but I caught enough to make me happy. Heck, I had even caught Nuja before I went off to the Indigo Plateau to face the Elite Four. But when I was going through Victory Road, something had happened that I did not expect. A Pokémon attack. But how was it possible? I had used a max repel so I would not have to deal with any wild Pokémon. Nevertheless, I was ready to make my move and flee the battle, until something caught my eye. For the wild Pokémon was no ordinary Pokémon. It was a Jengar, a 56 level Jengar. I didn't know how it was possible, because I knew for a fact that Jengar could not be caught regularly like its pre-evolved forms, Dastiel, and Hunter, let alone at level 56, but right now, none of that mattered. I was not going to miss out on this golden opportunity to catch a Pokémon that could not be caught regularly. Thus, I brought out my TYPH Loscion, who I had nicknamed Flame. When I first got him as a Cyndaquil early in the game, but trying to catch the Jengar was a pain in the neck for me. Luckily, I had managed to get his health down far enough for me to use a dusk ball on him, totally on edge. I watched as the dusk ball rocked back and forth 3 times before the click sound was made. I could only stare in shock and disbelief at the thought that I had caught a Jengar, one of my most favorite of Pokémon. Because of my little success, I started screaming like a madman out of joy and victory. Once I got through the whole Pokédex nonsense, I was asked if I wanted to give the Jengar a nickname. With a smile, I had settled on dubbing Jengar with the nickname of Nightmare. How I had come to deciding on that traveler, I was not sure. All I know was that it sounded awesome. From that point on, I had Nightmare on my team and he was a worthy Pokémon to have. With his help, not only had I managed to defeat the Elite Four and the champion, Lance, in one go, but I had also defeated all of the Kanto gym leaders, Kato-O, along with Entei, Suicide, Eni and Raikou, and even defeated Red, all on my first tries. But as time had gone by, I slowly started to play Soul Silver less and less, for I had bigger problems to deal with in the real world. My grandmother's health was declining. It wasn't until she had passed away in her battle from cancer that I had fallen into a great depression. Since then, I had stopped playing Soul Silver for what seemed like ages. It wasn't until the week before my first day of the fall semester that I was looking through my DS games, and I came across Soul Silver just then. It dawned on me that I had not played the game since my younger brother's high school graduation. Luckily, in the past few months that I had not played the game, I had bought a 3DS so I could play my DS games without having to fight my brother to play on his DS. So for my sake, I had decided to play Soul Silver and check up on my team. Little did I know was that things would not be the same. The game started normally, but when I loaded the game, things started to seem off. I recall that when I last saved the game, I was at the Pokémon Center at the base of Mount Silver, where I was going to fight against Red again. However, the usual Pokémon Center theme was not playing. In fact, there wasn't any music playing at all, just dead silence. What's more was that everything seemed literally darker, as the lighting seemed faulty, as if to give it that feeling that the lights were flickering on and off. Wondering what the hell was going on, I checked my Pokémon team to make sure they were still intact. Luckily, I had all my Pokémon still flame. Mine a Traveler from my TYPH Losia, Sparky the Pikachu, Rhydon, Lucario Lujo, Ada. That was strange. I couldn't find Nightmare on my team anywhere. Where could he possibly be? Shoving the thought aside, I closed my Pokémon team and walked out of the Pokémon Center, with Flame following close behind me. Just as I exited and I was outside, the text box opened, saying, "Ethan, there you are." At the sound of that, a question mark in a speech bubble appeared over my character. Before I knew it, the character, Sprite of Lyra, came rushing up to my character urgently. Somehow, I could feel her fear as she spoke with a message. "I have found Ryanie as badly injured, you have to come see." Before anything else could be said or done, I found Lyra leading my character over to the entrance of Mount Silver. There, much to my shock and horror, was the body of the game rival, Silver, or as I called him, Ryan. He was lying on the ground with a bit of red underneath him. most likely representing a puddle of blood. I made my character approach Ryan and clicked the A button, and Ryan spoke. "Ethan, is it really you? I was attacked by AAA Jenga. After he attacked me, he said something about finding some guy named Red. Here, take this." The next dialogue box that came up read, "Ryan gave Ethan the crucifix. Ethan placed the crucifix in the key items pocket." Once that was done, Ryan spoke once more. "Ethan, you have to stop him before it's too late." After I clicked A upon finishing with the text, I clicked the button again, and another text box came up. Ryan drew his last breath and died. The only thing I could do was gasp in horror. This couldn't be real at all. A Jenga he couldn't have meant. My Jenga nightmare, right? Shaking that off, I made Ethan approach the entrance of Mount Silver before I was stopped as Lyra approached me. "Hang on. Ethan, you can't go alone. That Jenga might make you suffer the same fate Ryan did. So I'm going with you." It was then that I was given the usual answer choice. Yes, no, coming to terms that this new story arc of the game was like no other, I decided that I would most likely need her help thus. I clicked the yes option. "Okay, let's go," Lyra said in response, and with that, my character, with Flame and Lyra following, entered into the cave. Upon entering, a text box came up. "Welcome, friends, come meet me up at the peak of the mountain. I've been expecting you." By now, I was starting to feel slightly disturbed. Nevertheless, I made Luigi use Flash, and my character, along with Flame and Lyra, navigated through the mountain, all the way up to the top. The further up we went, the more sprites of dead bodies I saw of Pokemon and humans, which made my stomach churn more and more. Eventually, we made it up to the peak and walked along the snowy trail until we reached the end of the path to where Red normally stood. However, Red was not standing in his usual spot. Instead, it looked like the sprite of a Jenga, its back turned towards my character. I was only a few steps away from the Jenga when Ethan and Lyra were both stopped. "So you finally decided to show up after all this time, have you? Well, it's about time. I've been waiting for you." When I pressed A, the Jenga turned to face Ethan and Lyra. "It's been way too long, Ethan. Or would you prefer that I call you by your real name, Ben?" Reading that almost made my heart stop. Nightmare couldn't have known my real name. It had to be just a game, right? That's all Pokemon is, really. A video game. They never had this kind of knowledge of their players, and they normally never broke the fourth wall. The only time that Pokemon broke the fourth wall was during the movies, and they were by Team Rocket. Jesse, James and me was Team Rocket. That is, nervously, I turned back to my 3DS as I clicked A. Lyra turned to look at me as she spoke. "Ethan, what is he talking about?" "Ah, so you haven't told her. Well, Benny boy, now, that's your chance to prove yourself," Nightmare said, approaching us. "Prove that you haven't lost your touch as a Pokemon trainer." I was given the usual white yes and no choice. At the sound of that, seeing my choices, I frowned and clicked no. As I did so, I said aloud, "I'd rather not." I was hoping that the Jenga would not attack then, but how did he reply? "You don't have a choice, Ben. We fight right here. RIGHTNOW. With that, Nightmare approached my character, and the battle began. Nightmare stood on one side of the screen, while Ethan and Lyra stood on the other, leaving me to realize that Lyra was going to fight, too. Suddenly, I noticed something completely different about Nightmare. He looked nothing like the Jenger I caught back on Victory Road now. His fur color was a darker shade of purple, almost completely black. Plus, there was a notch missing from his right ear, and he had a long red scar going vertically across his right eye, which looked more like a blind eye now. I then noticed something in his right hand, and I took a closer look to see it was a severed head. But it was no ordinary severed head. It was red severed head. Shaking that off, I clicked the A button almost immediately. Ethan sent Flame into battle, while Elvira sent out her Moril. Once that was done, Nightmare spoke. "Really, Ben? I was sure you were better than that, fighting with the Pokémon against one." I only frowned at reading that. The idea of a video game character scolding me just annoyed me. After all, it was only a video game. That's what I kept reminding myself as I played the game, choosing Flame's attack, Fire Blast. Luckily, I was the first to attack and it took a critical hit on Nightmare, taking half his health down. I wasn't sure how that was possible, seeing that Flame was only at level 63 and Nightmare was at level 75. It was after that hit that another dialogue box popped up. "Impressive, Ben." "Most impressive, my turn." I obviously knew that those were Nightmare's words, commenting on Flame's powerful attack. Suddenly, the sinister-looking Jenger made his move by throwing a shadow ball at Moril, given Moril's level of 57. I had expected Nightmare's attack to take out most of Moril's health, until it was really low in the red. Luckily, Moril managed to counter with a Hydro Pump, bringing down Nightmare's health by a bit to finish it off. I commanded Flame to use Flame Wheel, which depleted Nightmare's health completely. Despite this, Nightmare didn't sink from the battle screen. Instead, a text box popped up, Nightmare saying, "Well, it looks like you haven't lost your touch, despite your hiatus." Immediately, the game faded back to the overworld. For some reason, even though Lyra and I had defeated the Jenger that used to be mine, I had a strong feeling that the battle seemed as simple. Just then, Nightmare said, "Good job. Ben, you Ray still as good of a trainer since you and I defeated that so-called Pokémon Master everyone refers to as Red. What do you say we have a rematch?" At that question, I was given the usual, "Why yes and no choice." I had thought it over for half a minute and then nodded as I clicked A on the YES option. Once I made my answer, Nightmare said, "Excellent, meet me at the Ghost Tower in Lavender Town tonight at midnight. Don't be late." The screen faded to black and back to the mountain, revealing that Nightmare had left Ethan, Lyra, and Flame all alone at the peak. I could only feel slightly nervous about what could happen later on in the game. I was startled for my game when my mom came into my room. She had said that she and my dad and brothers were going to go out and about and wanted to know if I wanted to come along. With only my rematch with Nightmare on the brain, I nodded and agreed, turning off my 3DS for now. For the rest of the day, my family and I went to a few stores, saw a movie and even had dinner at a Max Ruby's. We managed to get home around 10:30 at night. By around 11:55, my parents and youngest brother were asleep, although my second to youngest brother was still awake and playing his games on the PlayStation 3 downstairs. Up until then, I was chatting with a friend of mine on AIM, telling him about my recently shocking experience with my Soul Silver game. At first, he thought I was crazy and that I was telling some sort of story, but as the discussion went on, he started to believe me. For a brief second, I looked up from my laptop to the clock, which now read 11:58. My eyes traveled to my lone 3DS, remembering the deal I had made with Nightmare and Soul Silver. However, I asked myself if I was willing to risk my sanity over a simple DS video game. If I didn't keep my promise, though, there was no telling what would happen. Nodding to myself as I made up my mind, I told my friend on AIM that I would be right back, closed my laptop, picked up my 3DS, turned it on and started Soul Silver. When I loaded my game, I found Ethan and Lyra, with Flame following, in Lavender Town as they approached the Pokemon Tower. If you recall how the town's theme in gold and silver, let alone heart gold and soul silver, seemed calmer and more soothing, that tone was not present in the game. Instead, the tone was more like that of the original Pokemon games, only remixed for Soul Silver, giving the song the creepy ambience it once had. Honestly, I had always hated the original tone of the Lavender Town theme. It was just nightmare-inducing. I shoved at thought as Ethan and Lyra stopped at the tower's doors, and they turned to one another. Something about this seems off. Ethan, are you sure you want to go through with this? She asked my character, giving the yes and no options. I only nodded as I clicked yes with that. I regained control of the game and walked the three into the doors. Instead of finding the characters inside what would look like a radio tower lobby, instead the lobby was big and bare, like it normally was in the earlier games before Gold and Silver. As the Lavender Town theme continued, I started to feel even more freaked out because spooky songs didn't agree with me late at night. I decided to switch the music with my radio, but when I went to check it, I saw that I had no radio immediately. I shook that off and trekked up the tower with Lyra and Flame following my character. Eventually, we reached the top of the tower, entirely looking like an HGSS remaster of the Pokemon Ghost Tower. We continued walking until we saw Nightmare waiting by the tombstone. As we approached him, the Jengar sprite turned to face us before the dialogue box popped up. Well, you actually managed to show up, Ben. I was beginning to think you chicken out and be halfway to Sinnoh by now. Lyra took her turn to speak, like we had a choice. Well, either way, we finish this now. Nightmare approached our sprites. It's payback time, Benny. And just like that, the battle commenced. As the battle started, the music changed to what sounded like the SAW theme. Hello Zep, except remixed in a way to make it sound like it was made for a Pokemon game. I didn't know how that song managed to find its way into the game, but I decided that didn't matter right now. Pushing that aside, I looked at Nightmare's level to see that, much to my shock, he was now at level 666, which I clearly knew as a number associated with the devil. Nevertheless, Lyra and I sent out our Pokemon, even if I knew neither of us stood a chance against Nightmare. At his high level, luckily, Flame and Lyra's Muriel managed to go first, but they barely made any damage on the ghost Pokemon. One by one, Nightmare wiped out all of our Pokemon, much to my surprise. Every time the Pokemon fainted, it said that they died instead of fainted. I obviously knew that Pokemon couldn't die, but apparently this game thinks that actually applies. As soon as all of our Pokemon were dead, Nightmare spoke. Oh, Dear, it seems I killed all of Benny and his girlfriend's poor, stupid little friends, Nightmare said, as a way of taunting me. Now, it's time to die. I gulped, knowing that Nightmare would kill both Ethan and Lyra, whom had slid onto the battle screen before Nightmare had even spoken. Much to my confusion, I saw that I was still in battle, instead of the word attack, though. I saw the word sand, since I had no other options. I chose sand. I read the outcome. Ethan threw sand at Nightmare. After that, I was treated with the animation of Ethan making a tossing gesture, followed by the sand attack. Animation, needless to say, that made Nightmare's sprite shake as he spoke. A-A-H-H and Y-E-Y-S. Instantly, the game returned to the overworld as Nightmare's sprite hopped up and down, a speech bubble appearing over his head with an angry emoticon inside of it. That only meant that, in my little victory, I had only enraged the Jenga. You good-for-nothing cheating boy, Nightmare said through text box. Ethan and Lyra turned to one another. Lyra, run for it. Ethan, almost immediately, the sprites of the two kids ran away from Nightmare, out of the burial ground and out of the POK Montara. Once outside, the two kids stopped and turned to one another. Lyra, Nightmare's not going to be picking sand from his eyes forever. Ethan, run as fast as you can and don't look back. With that, Lyra ran a scream before I regained control of Ethan. Immediately, I rummaged through my items bag and chose the bicycle. This had made Ethan board his bike before I guided him northward from Lavender Town, before I could exit the town, though I was interrupted abruptly from control as another text box popped up. Nightmare, where are you, Benjamin? Come back and face me, you selfish, cowardly BRAT. After closing that text box, I was given another one, with a different message. Nightmare's catching up to you. Better hurry. I took no second thoughts and guided Ethan as far away from Lavender Town as I could. After minutes and minutes of getting away from the ghost-inhabited town, I eventually found Ethan and stopped at a cliff the camera up and down, revealing water lapping with sharp rocks at the bottom before it panned back to Ethan facing downward before Nightmare, peak wave. A speech bubble with an exclamation point inside appeared above Ethan before he turned around. Just as Nightmare arrived, seeing him made my blood run cold. Immediately, another text box came up as the Gemmer spoke. Go on, Benjamin, jump from the cliff, kill yourself. It's your only way out. I was suddenly given the usual YES-NO option. Frowning, I chose NO. Nightmare's response. Nightmare, Keki you. Be got guts. Punk you. Do you rather die at my hands? The hands of your former companion. Nightmare's sprite took one step towards Ethan's. Tell me, Ben, do you still care about me? Again, I was given the YES-NO option. I spoke aloud. Of course I do. Nightmare, you ray one of my best POK-mon friends. As I said so, I chose YES, hoping that would do something good. However, Nightmare approached Ethan, bumping him and causing him to jump back once, as a way of hitting him. Nightmare, spare me your lies. Ben, you've forgotten about me. And for what? Your stupid brother's graduation? Your grandmother's death? The old hag deserved to die. She shouldn't mean anything to you. Reading that made me both insulted and horrified. Insulted, because I knew that my grandmother did not deserve to die. Horrified, because I did not know how the game could know about that. Up until this point, I kept convincing myself that it was nothing more than a game. Sadly, I knew that it would not do me any good right now, seeing that Nightmare obviously knew more about me than a game character should. Nightmare, now prepare to die. Immediately, Nightmare and I went into battle. For Ethan's attacks, he had punch, kick, struggle. Unfortunately, each time I chose the former three, I was given the same response. It doesn't affect Nightmare. And when I tried sand, the text box read, Nightmare. Avoided the attack much to my dismay. Nightmare managed to bring down Ethan's health until it was in the red. Before he spoke, Nightmare, this is it. Ben. Say goodbye. Out of options, I looked to my items option, looking through every item I had in the bag until I came to key items. There, I saw my only item, the crucifix that Ryan gave me. With no other choices, I clicked on the crucifix, clicked to use, and held my breath. Ethan did his toss animation as the item a crucifix flew right at Nightmare. Surprisingly, Nightmare's health depleted completely until it was empty before another text box came up. Nightmare. Impossible. How did you? The dialogue cut off there before Nightmare sank from the screen as these words came up in the text box. Nightmare died. With the battle over, the game once again came back to the overworld. Ethan stood there, Nightmare's sprite now laying before him. Nightmare, I swear I will get you, Benjamin. Nightmare lets out his last breath before he shuts his eyes. I could only sigh in relief, knowing I had just defeated my demon. Lyra's sprite then arrived, coming up to Ethan. Lyra, Ethan, I followed Nightmare, here as fast I could. I was scared that he might have killed you. Are you all right? As if I was expecting it. The YES&O option popped up. Smiling, I clicked YES. As I nodded with that, another text box popped up. Much to my surprise, this time, the dialogue seemed to be spoken by Gly. Ethan, yeah, I'm okay. Lyra, as finished now Nightmare. As reign of terror is over. It's finally over. His sprite turned to look southward. Ethan, Ben, thank you very much, I'll never forget you. Lyra came up next to Ethan. Lyra, thanks a bunch. Ben. I only smiled a sad smile as the screen faded to the credits, knowing that I managed to help the main character survive his battle. And yet, I was sad that it all cost him and Lyra their POKemon teams. As the credits rolled, a different tune played, a tune that sounded like Evanescence's Hello, remix to be played in a POKemon game. I opened my computer to talk with my friend, remembering that I'd chat with him before we got too far into our conversation. I heard another sound from my 3Ds. It sounded like the Lavender Town theme, except it was slowing down. I looked at the two screens. On the top one was a pair of glowing red eyes. The right one looking a bit blind, but then I saw the bottom screen, showing some text, and it read this. You think you've defeated me for good, that you're at peace, but you don't know anything. The top screen reveals what the red eyes belong to, a Jengar darker in color than any other Jengar, with a jagged scar across his eye that hit me. It was Nightmare. I wouldn't celebrate so soon. Benjamin, for as long as you live and breathe, I will haunt you and those you love. As I read that, both screens faded to black before fading to the opening titles of the game. The only thing I could do, though, was stare at the screen, nightmare's words echoing through my mind. I checked to see if my save file was still there, but there was no continue option, only new game and options. I only sighed in relief as I turned off my 3DS, no longer caring if I had to start my game over. Before I closed my 3DS to put it away, something caught my eye in the reflection of the top flap of the game system. A pair of glowing red eyes behind me. Out of panic, I turned my head quickly to see what the red eyes belonged to. However, nothing was behind me. Was I hallucinating? I only shook my head, putting my 3DS away sadly. I could not shake off the feeling of fear that nightmare's words had given me. Later that night, I placed on my crucifix necklace before going to bed, knowing that the crucifix in the glitch-ed-up version of my Soul Silver game had saved Ethan's life. Plus, it helped me to feel slightly safer ever since that night. I wore my necklace as a way of protecting myself, but at what cost? Each and every night, I had the dark feeling that no matter what, someone or something was in the dark, waiting for the chance to strike.